No, that might have been my bad.
No, that was probably me. I clicked on something and Skype froze, and then I had to force quit it.
Okay, no problem.
I'm so happy with the new Skype. Can you tell?
I can tell. So, what have you been up to?
Oh, good. I just attended 3 days of trial in Calgary. That was fun.
What was that for?
Oh, it was for the Honey Badger, well, Allison Tiemann versus Calgary Expo and the Mary Sue lawsuit. I was acting as assistant to counsel, plaintiff's counsel,
Hmm.
and so I got to sit through all of it and watch all of the. They initially, the defense wanted me to be a witness. They sent me a notice to attend, and then they found out that I wasn't going to just travel to Calgary and be available for 3 days for
Yeah.
them for $100 that they were offering me, and that I was entitled to almost $1,000, and I wrote them back in kind of one of those really civil but cunty kind of and pointed out their bad arithmetic and anyhow, so they dropped me from their witness list. And then when we realized that I can't testify, I was there when the incident happened, but I can't testify to anything that one of our other witnesses couldn't. So,
Hmm.
and obviously they wanted to talk to me about something, the defense, right? So I was like, well, why don't we just drop me from the witness list and I'll act as your assistant, keep track of your papers, write notes and stuff like
Hmm.
that. So that's what we did. They weren't happy about that. The defense were really not happy about that when they realized that they weren't going to get me on the stand.
Yeah.
So,
What was the trial about?
oh, Allison got kicked out of Calgary Expo. It's a big long thing. I'll be actually uploading a video, well, two videos, possibly up to an hour each,
Wow.
describing the whole thing. But she, she's the at the time she was the sole proprietor who owned Honey Badger Brigade, right?
What is Honey Badger Brigade?
It's sort of a started out as an all female men's rights multimedia platform.
Hmm.
So it was sort of like Women Against Feminism. It had a blog, a podcast. And it started out with me and Allison and a woman named Hannah Wallen down in Ohio. And it's since expanded from there. But uh, we have we've attracted a whole bunch of people who are artists, right? Musicians like Dr. Random Cam on YouTube, who plays guitar, composes music,
Yeah.
does puppetry and all kinds of other stuff,
Hmm.
right? And a lot of sort of nerdy, geeky artist types. So Allison is an independent comic creator. She has a graphic novel series called Xenospora, and she'd been to a bunch of comic cons run by this big Calgary Expo kind of umbrella company, um, and she wanted to essentially run a booth under the name Honey Badger Brigade and have a bunch of us come down and help her run the booth, and she would sell her Xenospora comics at the same time as promoting and selling some of this Honey Badger merchandise, right?
Yeah.
And we got a lot of donations for our fundraiser for that from people who took the side in the Gamergate conversation, that took the side of being for ethical journalism, full disclosure of interpersonal relationships, when you're reporting on somebody and things
Yeah.
like that. So we were much in line with the stated goals of Gamergate, of certain people within the Gamergate community, and a lot of those people actually donated to our fundraiser. So we had this banner made up with a little GG and then ethics and stand against censorship and a bunch of honey badgers and as kind of like as a thank you, and we displayed it at our booth, and
Hmm.
that was apparently enough to get her and us, our group, evicted forthwith, no investigation whatsoever, and banned for 10 years from all events run by this organization.
Wow.
Oh, yeah, and they gave us because it was about 10:30 in the morning, half an hour before it opened to the public. She had made this. She's an industrialist. She's got a master's of not industrial, a master's of environmental design. And she had made. She didn't just have a normal booth where you have like shelves and stuff. She had this like massive custom-made skin that went over the
Yeah.
booth. It was completely decorated with all of her comic book art and this weird podium and this giant LED lit space funnel that stood 16 feet high. Yeah, and
Dang, yeah.
all of this weird stuff, and an 8 foot tall banner for her comic book, and all of these things that she'd paid huge sums of money for. And I think she invested about $6,000 in just that, and it took about 5 hours to set up with specialized tools, and they required us to take it down without tools in half an hour, so all of that
Yeah.
got wrecked. And
Dang, that's a
or
bummer.
they call the cops and have us removed.
Wow.
Oh yeah, because we were dangerous. It was like listening to the guy testify on the stand about how we posed after he looked into us. We posed like a existential, clear and present physical threat to the safety of the convention. And I'm like, we're the three middle-aged women and a Puerto Rican guy. Like, hell.
Oh, dang.
Oh, it was bad. So I'm gonna have this video describing all of that because there were some real weird things that happened at this trial that all of them coming from the defense
Yeah.
that were that just blew me away.
Mm.
So many improper, like the defense counsel,
Mm.
who was fired by both the defendants, right at the last minute. His last act on their behalf may actually get him disbarred.
Wow, dang. That'll be an interesting video to see. I'm excited to see that.
Yeah, no, it was pretty crazy.
Do you want to start off just by introducing yourself?
Sure. Okay, so I am Karen Straughan. I'm 47 years old. I'm a mother of three, divorced. Used to wait tables. Now I do anti-feminism and men's rights. It's probably not the career that my high school guidance counselor had in mind for me, but I just kind of fell into it. I appear to be good at it, and that's what I do now. So.
Yeah, perfect. I'm excited to talk to you. My first question is, what is masculinity?
Masculinity is a set of traits and expectations, right? That traits that men naturally have or are more likely to naturally have, and expectations that are largely based on those traits. I think it's just most men naturally have these traits, and therefore it's expected that men will have these traits. So.
Yeah. What are some of those traits?
Stoicism, or sort of being emotionally stable. Maybe stoicism might not be the right word, but being emotionally stable. An ethic of service. Sort of helping the old lady walk across the street, stopping to help someone change their tire. Those kinds of things. Those are all tied to traditional masculinity. Protection, provision. Being more productive than producing more than you consume. That's a big expectation on men. Not being a coward. Absolutely a huge expectation that's placed on men. A lot of these too, they do have a large amount of sort of biological backing, suggesting that they're at least partly innate. When you look at sort of that emotional stability, that you don't break down and start sobbing when things go wrong. There is the boys don't cry element of enculturation for sure, but until puberty, boys and girls are physiologically identical in terms of the structures that produce and shed tears, um, particularly emotional tears. But when boys go through puberty, their tear glands shrink and become less productive. Their tear ducts get
Hmm.
wider. So they have to produce more tears before they're going to spill from the wider ducts. And at the same time, they're not capable of producing as many. So biologically, they've been sort of uh, that kind of not getting distressed, not expressing those kinds of emotions has actually been, it's actually evolved in men
Hmm.
in ways that it isn't in women.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Do you think that all these traits that are expected from men, do you think that's positive or negative?
Well, it depends on what the trait is and how extreme it is. I mean, like there's when you look at masculinity as sort of a spectrum of behavior. I mean, certainly there are some things that if you went from if you looked at a willingness to take physical action, right? There's nothing immoral about that. It's a completely amoral concept. A willingness to take physical action. That's going to be somebody who's willing to uh, go into a burning building and rescue someone. That's going to be somebody who is willing to step in between someone who's attacking another person and that person to protect them. Um, Things like that, right? But it also means, on the other end of the spectrum, a willingness to act physically in the world in that way. Well, that's also part and parcel of, unacceptable forms of violence, right? So you kind of, the aspects, the traits are themselves contextual, in terms of the situation. Um, so I would say they're neither positive nor negative. I would say that they're morally neutral, and it really depends on how they play out. One writer on masculinity said, God, and I forget who it was, said something like, "You can't convince a boy to be a flower child, a masculine boy, right? But you can convince him to become a knight, affirm the knight, right?
Hmm.
So that's really how I look at it, and it's the way I look at femininity as well. So
What? Well, let's go back a little. So you say, um, so right now you fight for men's rights and anti-feminism, right?
mm.
How did you get into that?
Oh, that I stumbled. I was writing dirty books for women way back when in 2009, and had a couple of them published, and I was a member of several forums, review sites, and writers forums and stuff like that. And at one day, and I don't even remember which of these sites it happened on, but one day somebody posted let's a link to a men's website and said, "Let's go laugh. Let's all go laugh at these men." And these women, 90% of them or more were hardcore feminists. I mean, they were. I remember making a comment on one of these sites to the effect of, I don't consider myself a feminist. I consider myself an equalist or something like that. And like 350 angry comments later, I was just like, you're not actually convincing me. You're just making me dig my heels in here. Um, so I went over there and I saw uh, the comments section of this article, and it was a really kind of a trivial article. It was a trivial complaint about science fiction being feminized with romantic subplots, and you can't get hard science fiction anymore.
Hmm.
But I saw this swarm of feminist women just attack the comment section, and I saw all of these men just resist. All they did was just resist. Some of them hit back, just as hard. Some of the language that these feminists were using was just absolutely sexist, shaming, sexually shaming language. You have a little penis and you just can't get laid, and you're fat and ugly and no woman would want you, and all of this stuff that apparently they think is not okay until it's time for them to do it. but I watched these men how they reacted, and I was quite surprised because usually men just back down when that happens, and these guys weren't backing down. They were sticking to their guns. They were standing their ground, and I got involved in the conversation. And so after all these feminists went away, I stumbled across this comment from one of the guys there who said, uh, "Well, at least the new Star Trek was pretty cool. I ripped it off the internet and watched it like 10 times." And I was like, okay, now I need to write a response to this, because this is just like, who would spend $300 million to make a movie for you? You idiot! Your girlfriend will drag you to the theater. She'll buy you the DVD set, right? But you're just gonna steal the content? No wonder. You guys are your own problem, right? And they all agreed, right?
Yeah.
And then they knew I was a woman, and then I just joined the conversation, and it was like, as long as you didn't ask for special treatment because you were a woman, they were interested in talking, and you were welcome there. And I read a bunch of articles on that site that were a lot less trivial than the one that I stumbled on first. Articles about sexual violence, domestic violence, child sexual abuse, all kinds of stuff like that. Things that don't generally get attention when they happen to men. And I was just like, okay, well, I was curious, and I learned more and got to writing about it, and I guess it just snowballed when I started my channel to dispel the rumors that I was really just a fat, ugly, middle-aged man living in his mother's basement covered in Cheeto dusts, because that's what people kept saying about me when I was just blogging. So I did videos, and it just snowballed from there. So
Yeah. Um, what is the relationship between feminism and masculinity?
I think feminists have a very, very love-hate relationship with masculinity, with traditional masculinity. They really love certain aspects of it. Chivalry, they really like that. There's been all kinds of research done on the expectations of how you're treated by men, that women really don't want to be treated by men the way men treat other men, and that other people, both men and women, object to that happening. They don't like it. They see men who treat women the way they treat other men as hostily sexist against women. And I think that feminists really harness certain aspects of what they would call patriarchal norms, like men's willingness to act physically in the world. When they talk about bystander intervention programs and stuff like that, to fight sexual assault on campuses. When they talk about women not having to take any measures to look to their own safety, that women shouldn't have to do that. Well, who else is going to do that now? That's going to fall on men, right? They really do love that provide and protect aspect of masculinity, and they exploit it all the time. Whether it comes down to raising or lowering the amount of child support that will land arrears that will land a man in prison, or talking Governor Scott, Rick Scott of Florida, to veto an alimony reform bill because women deserve that money and they would just be destitute if they didn't get it. They can't take care of themselves. Tax money just eaten up by women and children, particularly single mothers. They really, and those taxes, there's also reason to believe that women don't make any net positive tax contribution in their lifetimes. Over the course of their lifetimes, they never get above a zero balance in terms of what they've put in versus what they've taken out. So all of that money is coming from men too. And so essentially, special laws to protect women from violence. One of the most amazing things that I discovered in the course of what I do is that women are the safest demographic in society when it comes to violence. That includes children. Children are more likely to experience violence than women are. And male children from the age of 9 months are 2 to 3 times hit 2 to 3 times more frequently than girls by their caregivers. So
Hmm.
you're looking at across the board from the time kids become ambulatory all the way to dead of old age. You're looking at males having a much more high likelihood of experiencing violence than women do, and children also doing, and having that, and so yet we have a Violence Against Women Act. We have federal domestic violence against women legislation here in Canada too. They might call it domestic violence, but what they really mean is violence against women. And we have policies designed around that lead to things like men being more likely to be arrested than helped when they call for help when their spouse is being abusive. So you're looking at all of this special, kinder, more gentle, more protective treatment that feminists demand of women. Those are all traditional aspects of masculinity, to provide those things, and to not ask for any of those things themselves. So, and then you look at how they respond when they see a man complaining about science fiction having romantic subplots,
Yeah.
right? You go over there and tell him he has a tiny penis and no woman would ever want to fuck him, right?
Yeah.
And so that's enforcement of masculinity. That's what that is.
Hmm. Yeah. That's interesting. Why do you think it's not talked about very much what it means to be a man in popular culture? Why do you think there's not very much discussion about that?
Oh, I think all of the discussion of late, probably over the last 10 years, has been on what men should not be. So that men should not be rapists, and men should not be abusers, and men should not be harassers, and men should not be this, and not be that, and not the other thing. There is something that they use in research, like gender research, called the Conformity to Masculinity Inventory, and I think it was 1974 or something when they designed that, and it used to be sort of a hodgepodge of positive and negative traits and traits that could be contextually one or the other given the situation, things like that, right? Um, and now they've sort of updated it several times to be almost entirely a list of negative traits. Um, and so essentially, we don't talk about what men should be, um, because we're too busy talking about how bad they are.
Yeah. What effect does that have on men?
I think that if you're a man and you already have a strong sense of self, it's probably like water off a duck's back. But I would hate to be a boy being raised in this culture. These are these like 5-year-old, 6-year-old, 7-year-old boys who are, who know they know that they are never to hit a girl while their classmates are wearing "boys are stupid, throw rocks at them" T-shirts. They know by the age of 10 or 12 or 14 that they are not well liked by their teachers, that by their female teachers in particular. And by the time, because there is a measurable bias on the part of female teachers against boys in elementary schools, it's down to it's not even down to stereotype threats or things like that can be explained in other ways, um, or there are alternative hypotheses, I guess you would say. What seems to be the case is that the same piece of work, if you put a boy's name on it, it gets a lower grade than if you put a girl's name on it, from female teachers. And compared to those female teachers, and when they're gender blinded. So essentially, you have boys knowing this. They wager less money on the likelihood of them getting a good grade if they, one, know the teacher grading them is a woman, and two, that she will know that they're a boy. So, I mean, that's got to be really, really difficult. It's got to be difficult to be pulled aside in middle school to an assembly where you're listening to how men abuse women and then asked to stand and take a pledge for the 100th time in your life that you'll never hit a girl. Because domestic violence is apparently a one-way street, and no woman ever hit any man ever. Um, so it's, so you're sort of learning through that process that you're uniquely monstrous and disliked, right? Um, Sexual violence is a big issue with me in terms of there was some research done back in the 1980s, I believe, that showed that more than 50% of men in this study who had been convicted of raping women had been sexually abused by an adult woman during childhood or adolescence. And at the same time, and this is research that is very, very interesting to me. I would like to see that those studies repeated and try to be replicated or falsified, right? But there's nobody who's paying any money to do those kinds of studies. Nobody wants to hear that. And then there was a study by a charity in the UK called Kidscape that deals with abused kids, and they said that when kids were sexually abused by women and reported it, disclosed to someone, 86% of them were not believed by the first person they disclosed to, and almost all of them had disclosed to somebody with a duty of care. So a cop or a nurse or school counselor or a teacher, somebody who actually had a responsibility to look into it. 86% of them were not believed. And this is boys and girls. Just because the perpetrator, they told the person that the perpetrator was female. So you're looking at this massive issue that could actually, if we dealt with it properly, reduce the amount of women getting raped 20 years from now. But nobody wants to look at it because it doesn't reflect very well on women. Nobody wants to believe that of any woman. We seem to be uniquely capable of believing horrible things about every man, or masculinity in general, or the male sex, but we don't want to even look at those kinds of behaviors when women exhibit them. So it's not even on a case-by-case basis in large part. We don't see it as harmful.
So, boys are taught a lot of things not to do. What traits would you say we should teach boys to do and, like, embody these parts of masculinity?
Oh, rough and tumble play is a huge one. Rough and tumble play is actually something that's necessary for proper physical and emotional development, and it's something that's like increasingly being restricted. Fathers tend to engage in that with their kids more than mothers do. So when you have boys raised, boys in particular benefit from this. Girls do too, though. When you have kids raised without fathers, they often are deprived of this experience. And what rough and tumble play does is it teaches you boundaries, physical boundaries, the limits of your physical capabilities. It teaches you what hurts and what doesn't. It teaches you when to stop. When somebody actually does get hurt or asks you to stop, and you have to stop. So essentially, it teaches a whole bunch of these things, some of which are vital for the development of healthy empathy. Free play in nature. That's another big one that we've deprived probably the last two generations of kids of, is, go outside with your friends and come home when the street lights come on. We don't do that anymore, and playing without adult supervision teaches kids, particularly boys, how to mediate disputes on their own without how without adult intervention, without a lawyer essentially coming in and telling you, okay, you say sorry, now you have to play with that person. And it teaches them the boundaries of social behavior. What lines do I have to stay behind before the rest of the group is going to exclude me for not getting along? So when you look at that, that's father involvement and free play in nature are two of the biggest predictors of the healthy development of empathy in children, particularly in boys. So I would absolutely 100% say free play in nature, unsupervised by adults. Like maybe put them somewhere safe, but you don't have to intervene every time they have a problem. They've done this in 4 New Zealand schools. Uh, Brought back old school recess, no rules, and no adult supervision. There's adults in the school if you need them, if somebody really gets hurt, but otherwise you can play with old tires, construction waste, climb trees, skateboard without a helmet. Doesn't matter. Do what you want. And they found that not only did injuries go down, but bullying was reduced to almost nothing. So, um, injuries being, I think the idea is the same as with the difference between head injuries in rugby players versus football players. There are fewer head injuries in rugby players because they don't wear as much padding. And it seems counterintuitive, but it's because they're actually just more careful about bonking their heads.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Oh, that's really interesting. Well, are your children? Do you have boys?
I have 2 boys. One is 23 and the other is 15. And he's a giant, 6'1".
Wow.
And my daughter is 21.
Okay.
So
What difficulties did you have, or what did you do to promote positive masculinity in them as you were raising them?
I think a lot of it had to do with just demonstrating a sort of team-oriented relationship with their dad as much as possible. And I was never one of those people who was afraid to get my hands dirty or do physical work or do what would be considered to be men's work. I have a fence under construction right now. That's my project, and so it's essentially I just always get dirty, play with spiders and snakes, jump. Yes, you can jump from there. Did that with all my kids. Was very, very much a hands-off kind of parent in terms of, I did what most dads do, I guess, which is set fewer rules but enforce them more rigorously than mothers tend to do, and that seems to be what builds a certain character in your kids, a certain toughness, and an awareness of their own limitations at the same time, right?
Yeah.
And that's really what you want in your kids. You want them to not feel like they're made out of glass and not break at the first difficulty that they have, but you do also want them to have a sense of their own limitations so that they don't, when you say, yes, you can jump from there, they don't climb 5 feet up and jump from there, right? So
Yeah. Did you have to? Did you have like a problem with the schools and stuff when they were coming up with regards to their masculinity, like the stuff you're talking about?
I didn't with my oldest, but that was because he was just extremely quiet and bookish. He's a very, very. His teacher used to complain that when he's not working, I don't notice it because he doesn't make any trouble, right? So sometimes he goes all day and he doesn't do a lick of work, and I only notice it at the end of the day, right? He was just so quiet. My youngest has always had issues. I mean, he came home from, I guess it was grade 2. He was about half an hour late walking home from school. We lived just like right near the school, and he charges in the door. He says, "Guess what, Mom? I got detention." And I'm like, "Oh, okay, what happened?" He says, I got into a brawl. And I said, okay, you're going to have to actually go back a few steps and tell me exactly what happened. And he says, well, my friend, there were these two bigger kids and they were picking on him and they were pushing him around and they were shoving him down and stuff. So I just jumped in and I started swinging. And then I accidentally kicked my friend in the nuts. And I was like, well, that probably wasn't too fun for him. And he says, I got to fill out all these forms. And so he sat down, and it was this incident report that, I had to fill one out, and he had to fill one out. And one of the questions was, what did you do wrong? And I said, getting involved, getting directly involved is what you did wrong. And he's like, but, and I'm like, just write it down or you're going to have more detention, right? Mm. This is what they want to hear. And then what would you do differently next time? And I'm like, go tell an adult is what you need to put there. Just go tell an adult. And he says, but I don't know that I would. And I'm like, I don't expect you to, right? I think I'm very proud of you for trying to help your friend. I'm very proud of you for, being willing to act in the moment when you saw something going wrong, something bad happening. But this is what they want to hear, and so you're going to have to tell it to them. And he said that he might do it again if it ever came up, and I was just like, that's okay by me. If you get detention for it, you're not going to be in any trouble at home. So, and he's been, he tried out, did football camp this spring, and really seemed to thrive on it. But it really wasn't until football camp that he sort of had any inclination towards anything the school offered him in an extracurricular way. And he's got a sort of doesn't have a great relationship with school in terms of enjoying being there. So
yeah,
it's just not it's not an environment he enjoys. So
that's pretty common, I think.
Yeah, well, I hated school too. So
yeah.
all the way through.
Yeah. What are some positive aspects of masculinity? Or we can start with the negatives. What do you think are some negative aspects of masculinity?
Well, men definitely have lower risk aversion. They're less prone to hesitate, and that can turn into problems. It's also it's a very useful thing to have. A group of people who have low risk aversion, right? When buildings are burning down or an earthquake happens and you need somebody to dig people out of the rubble, that really helps there. So I mean, like that. I think the issue, a willingness to put yourself at physical risk, to act yourself physically. That's another one that women don't tend to have. There really are that. When people talk about fight or flight responses to danger, there's actually 3 different responses that happen. One is fight, and one is flight, and one is freeze and scream. And women tend to be the freeze and scream more often than the other, or run. Men are more likely to stick with it and actually deal with whatever threat or problem there is, and that's an extremely useful trait, but it can also cause problems. So I think that it's the issue with right now, the negative one of the negative things about masculinity is sexual aggression, right? That's talked about all the time, sexual aggression. But sexual assertiveness in men is absolutely 100% necessary, or nobody would be having sex at all. When you look at the amount of sex that certain types of couples have, or certain types of people have, gay men, hands down, the winners in terms of the amount of sex that they have. right? And the reason why is the same reason that lesbians have the least sex. Um, it's because gay men don't have to convince a woman, right, to
Hmm.
have sex with them. And heterosexuals are right in the middle. And if you didn't have men actually having that higher sexual impulsivity and higher sex drive, and that leads them to do risky things like risk rejection by approaching women, nobody would be hooking up at all. And so, I mean, essentially, what you're looking at, and I think what I'm trying to explain here is you're looking at a series of traits that, on one end, can be really positive, right? But when expressed in a different context or in another way, can actually be harmful, right? So, and I like I said, I feel the same way about feminine traits as well. So, I don't think that there are positive and negative masculine traits. There are masculine traits. We try to cultivate the virtuous end. We always have. We have an entire canon of Western literature designed around cultivating the positive end of the spectrum of all of those traits, right? But the base traits themselves are quite neutral and can play out in different ways.
Yeah. Can you maybe list off some of those traits and like say what it looks like when they're taken too far into a negative direction? What's the positive version of those?
Well, strength, physical strength, physical prowess. I think the negative aspect of that would be doping in sports. Certain types of body dysphoria rather. Women get anorexia and bulimia more often. Men tend to get that, I really need to be the beefy bodybuilder, right, to an absolutely unhealthy degree. So there's those things. So strength, being willing to take risks. That's why there are more men in prison, and it's also why there are more men in politics and as CEOs. That's why when you have sort of a banking crisis like we had in 2008, where the banks needed to be bailed out, a lot of the actors involved in causing that to happen were male, and it's because of that low risk aversion. But at the same time, men are the ones who are running into a burning building to rescue someone. Men are the ones who, almost invariably, are the ones who act immediately at high risk to themselves in situations where they could be injured or killed, right? Um, so you're just not going to see as many women pulling someone off the subway tracks right in front of the train as you see men doing stuff like that. And it's not because women aren't capable of doing it physically. It's because women don't act in a spontaneous way like that when there's a significant risk involved. They're much less likely to do that. There are some women who do it, but you know, um, I probably should have said way at the beginning. Hashtag not all. Um, but okay, so strength, emotional stability, huge one. Feminists seem to have women brainwashed into believing that they want to see men show their emotions and cry and all of these other things. And but when push comes to shove and men actually do that, um, women don't respond very well at all. They may think that they want to see that and behaving in those ways, but that's really not the case. And again, the willingness to provide, willingness to produce more than you can consume, and hand the excess, hand the surplus to women and children. That's like a massive, massive expectation of masculinity that does not, we don't expect women to produce more than they consume. We don't expect women to hand their surplus to members of the opposite sex. Um, in fact, the only reason, I don't know if you remember the alimony reform bill that I mentioned a while ago, that Governor Rick Scott vetoed twice at the 11th hour after it had passed both houses. And he vetoed it to maintain that line of provisioning for women. But the primary reason that it had public support and bipartisan support in both houses was because women are now 5%, oh my goodness, 5% of lifetime alimony payers in Florida. And it's unacceptable that women should have to pay men to sit around on their asses.
Mm.
So essentially, that aspect of masculinity, we don't expect that of women. We don't expect women to earn money and then just give it away to other people, for other people's benefit. And you even see that in how people arrange their marriages when men are the primary breadwinner. About 80% of the financial decisions are 50-50 between the husband and the wife, right? Whereas when women are the sole breadwinner, women control almost all of the spending decisions on their own. They give their husbands an allowance. He doesn't have access to the bank account. So you're essentially looking at when women produce, they don't want to be forced to share it. But that's been an expectation on men for ever and ever and ever. So
Yeah. Can you talk a little more about men and emotional stability? And because I've talked to people, and it seems like I've talked to people on both sides of the issue, people on the left and on the right, or just more people that are more conservative about it and more, I guess, liberal about it. But it seems like a lot of the people on the left, and they're talking about hypermasculinity and stuff, are they talk a lot about how men have an inability to express themselves and how it's important that we can just show all of our emotions. Do you think that men have trouble expressing their emotions, or do you think it's positive as it is now, or what?
I think that, like I said, there are biological reasons why men don't express their emotions the way women do. I think there's a huge amount of difference in how men and women handle things like fear, grief, sadness, and stuff like that. So those negative emotions that they seem to be talking about wanting men to express. Right now, there is, I'm sure, a certain amount of men choosing not to express those emotions or being trained out of expressing them because of the negative reaction from the culture, a reaction that just really doesn't contain a whole lot of compassion. But at the other end of things, I would say that after having looked into some of Tom Golden's work, he's a clinical psychologist who specializes in men, and in particular how men heal and how they grieve. Men just don't. They're hashtag not all again, okay, but men just in general just don't express themselves the way women do. They do express themselves, but they don't do it in the ways that women do. And
How so? How are those ways?
well, he put it in terms of when men and women get stressed, um, they respond differently. Women do something that they use these little rhymes in psychology because you gotta do rhymes. But tend and befriend. So when women get stressed out, they reach out to people, right? When men get stressed out, they pull back, right, and sort of take a break, and they try to find some kind of service um, to to. So if you look at something like he used, I think it was it Michael Jordan. Um, there was something that when his dad died, um, he kind of pulled back from things and thought for a while, and then he went and won this championship. And when he won it, he laid down in the middle of the court and said, "That's I did that for my dad." Right? What's his name from the band Cream? Uh, God, I can't remember the name. He's a musician, guitarist. wrote the song "Tears in Heaven" after his son fell to his death at age, I think, 4 or something like that. He pulled back and he wrote an album. That's what he did to deal with that. The idea that men don't express their emotions, if you just look at um, the fact that they will put their hands to something and try to make something, right? They try to, they don't necessarily want to talk about it, right? They'll stand shoulder to shoulder at a workbench with somebody and work with their hands rather than do that.
Hmm.
And those are the ways that I think we've forgotten that those are ways that a lot of men would actually rather deal with their emotions than talking about them with a therapist or crying. Um, and we've forgotten them because I think because we've removed men from the young lives of kids over the last few generations. Um, when you look at how many kids grow up without their dads, the first time that they might come across a male teacher um, or a male caregiver in their lives might be grade 8 math. Um, they just don't often have men in their lives day to day, and those men are often not as present as they would have been, say, 300 years ago. Um, back when most people were living an agrarian lifestyle and the home was the workplace, right? And the men were always there. So I think, honestly, I would tell feminists maybe you could just leave men alone and let them express themselves. As long as they're not hurting anybody, they could maybe express themselves the way they choose. Um, I certainly am not a highly emotional type of person. I have some masculine characteristics according to the personality test that I was stupid enough to fill out when Jordan Peterson asked me to. Um, and he put all of the scores, and then way at the bottom, low in conscientiousness, and then no comment. But yeah, I think he was trying to make a point there. Or a little dig. But I I express myself much more like a man than I do like a woman, and that's why I spent so much time in that highly masculinized space at that website, at that men's website. The absolute lack of passive aggression there. I mean, it was all aggression. It was just aggression. There was no passivity about it, right? You never had to look for, okay, is this person giving me some kind of backhanded insult, right? Like in this, they're acting really nice to my face. Oh my God, is there a knife back there, right? Yeah, you never had to worry about that. You knew exactly what these guys were thinking, and they had a very high threshold as to what they considered um, unacceptable behavior that was beyond the pale, worthy of an apology, right? Um, and that's either on the giving or the receiving end, right? And that's always sort of been more the way I've been. I don't apologize often. I don't expect apologies ever, really. I express myself quite plainly. I don't do passive aggressive BS like pretending to like you and then you know doing something mean behind your back. And that's one of the things too that if you want to talk about toxic femininity, it's that manipulation and relational aggression and reputational destruction and rumor mongering and backstabbing and backbiting and infighting and catfighting and all of those things that actually women are more likely to do, and engaging systems to do their aggression for them. Tattling and things like that, right? Or calling the police and making false accusations. Those are also predominantly female things. 80% of false accusations are made by women. So I would not want to be told. Okay, now that I'm circling back around, um, I would not want to be told that it's unhealthy that I don't like to cry in public. Right? I have cried in public. Um, when I do cry in public, like while I was in Australia at a conference last summer, I got the call walking to the conference that my dog had just passed away.
Mm.
Um, and of course, I started crying, and I'm in public, and then I get there, and everybody wants to hug me and console me, and I just wanted them to just leave me alone, right? Because you're just going to make it worse. Being nice to me is just going to make it worse. It's going to make me lose control over my emotions, and then I'm going to embarrass myself in public, and I don't want to do that. Um, and I don't know that that's necessarily a horrible, unhealthy thing. Um, then you go back someplace private and you have your cry, and you don't vomit your unbridled emotions and emotional state all over everyone around you and make them responsible for how you feel. And I think that if we could actually, if I had my way, I would cultivate some of that in women rather than try and further erode it in men. Because we are social creatures, and our relationships with other people, whether they're shallow or very intimate, um, are a constant negotiation and a constant state of bargaining as to how much they are willing to tolerate from us and how much we are willing to tolerate from them. And right now, I see that, these feminist women, they'd really love to create a society of complainers and complainers over the tiniest, most minuscule shit. And let's get the men on board too, and
Yeah.
I don't see that as being helpful. I see that being on another extreme end of what's complaining is fine, but nobody wants to be around someone who complains about everything all the time. And crying is fine, but I don't generally like having to deal with other people's crying, and I don't want them to have to deal with mine. So,
Yeah. Can we talk a little bit more about how you said that you have some typically masculine characteristics? Has it been important for you to embrace your masculine side?
oh yeah, no. I was always a tomboy, and when I think it was 8 or 9, my parents got me the best Christmas present any kid could ever get. It was a space Lego set that was so huge, that it had to have cost about $600 in adjusted dollars. I was blown away because my parents were really working class and they didn't spend money on much, right?
Yeah.
I was just blown away. Um, I Easy bake oven, sure, because you can actually make stuff to eat in it. But then again, I was using stove and things like that. Like my mom was always fearless about putting on a pair of rubber boots and screeding concrete too, right? Or getting up on the roof and fixing shingles. So and my dad was, his mantra was sort of, if there's no blood, it doesn't hurt. You know, he he definitely was, if you really were hurt, he would deal with it, but he didn't want to hear anybody just complaining about, oh, I bonked my head or whatever, and I want to complain. If there was no injury, right, then he didn't want to hear it.
Mm-hmm.
And he lived his life, sort of has always lived his life according to that. If there's no injury, then it's nothing to worry about, right? Um, but and we were just I hunted salamanders and frogs, and I did all of these, like my knees were always skinned, and climbed trees, broke my back, jumping off of a gymnasium roof.
Wow. That's intense.
But I didn't realize I'd broken it until a year ago. That's the only thing that I can remember that would have actually caused 2 compression fractures of my vertebrae.
There's no
That
blood.
that
Maybe.
have been there since I've always had a bad posture since I can remember, and that's what we just discovered on an X-ray that's what that is. So
Wow.
yeah.
Do you think it's important for men to embrace their female characteristics?
Oh, of course. I mean, we all have a little bit of each in us, and I think it is healthy to embrace your feminine side, nurturing, and like the stereotypically feminine traits, nurturing, asking for help. That would be a big one. As a men's rights activist, I would really appreciate it even more if before we convince men to ask for help, we actually have it there for them. Because as a man, you know, bringing yourself to ask for help only to find that there is none, that's got to really suck. Um, you know, Relaxing a little, taking better care of yourself. Self care is a big one. Women tend to do that, men not so much. Um, but essentially, I think that what we need to find is some kind of healthy balance in terms of that. And that doesn't necessarily mean that men are going to behave exactly like women do. Men and women's personalities. Um, there's a study that was done in 2010, I believe, um, that took data from a previous study. They'd taken all of the personality data from this previous study that had used big five characteristics. Um, and they had found that there was almost no difference in personality between men and women on average. But when you actually broke down the big five characteristics into their univariate traits, um, then what you ended up seeing was, okay, so let's say uh, apprehension and vigilance, right, could easily be two separate personality traits in response, that express in response to a perceived threat, right? One is apprehension, the other is vigilance. Well, vigilance much higher in men, apprehension much higher in women. Warmth and affiliation much higher in women. That's a form of extroversion, the big five category extroversion. Dominance and venturesomeness is also a form of extroversion, right? And when you take the score, on warmth women score 10 and men score 1, and on dominance men score 10 and women score 1, but they both have a score of 11, so they're exactly the same. They're equally extroverted, is what this previous study found in terms of how it parsed the data. But when you actually looked at the individual subtraits themselves, what you found was there's only a 10% overlap in personality between men and women. And when you remove the biggest single difference, can you guess what it is?
Um,
Sensitivity higher in women.
hmm.
Sensitivity higher in women. When you remove that, there's still only 24% overlap in men's and women's personalities on average. So you're not going to, I don't think that you're ever going to see men become women. There's just too much different. The male and every single species with males and females has sex roles. Every single one. They have different reproductive strategies, and they have sex roles. I don't think that we would be any different, and I think that our innate psychology would steer us more towards conforming to those sex roles than away from them.
Yeah.
In general, on average.
Yeah.
Hashtag not all.
Kind of in closing, what do you see as important about masculinity in your life? Why is masculinity important?
Oh, it's hugely important. Like that uncomplaining nature is just sort of the the uncomplaining nature is part and parcel of the role. The role is, again, produce more than you consume, share it with others. I have a wonderful, like my ex, get along great with him. He had some issues. I had some issues that made us incompatible in the long run. But he's strong. He has certain protective character to him. I never, ever, ever have felt endangered in his presence, even when we were, fighting like mad. Never felt in danger in his presence, and moreover, never felt endangered by anybody else, including bears and cougars, while in his presence. Um, and we did live in a wilderness area where we had cougars walking down the sidewalk
Wow.
sometimes in the middle of the day. So, and the guy that I'm with right now, just the amount of work and effort that he puts in, you could not make me do his job for love or money. You could pay me $1 million a year, and I would say I'm gonna go wait tables because his job just makes me, even when he talks about it, makes me want to stab myself in the face just to make him stop. Just stop describing your work. I don't care about JavaScript. Um, and so, but he worked really hard to get where he was. He put in way more effort than I would have been willing to, against extremely high odds, in terms of just where he began, his beginnings, his humble beginnings, and where he is now. He did so despite having an autoimmune disease that makes it really difficult just to get through a day. And that's part of that masculine sort of determination and ambition to be more productive, and to produce more than you consume, and to use that for the benefit of others, which he does with me and my kids. So, honestly, I just the those are the things that I value, and I value the fact that he will speak straight with me. He will tell me exactly what he thinks, and he won't sugarcoat it. And so, yeah, there you go. I don't know whether most women like that, though. So.
Yeah. What is the biggest misunderstanding that you've seen about masculinity in general?
Oh, I think that it's entirely enculturated. I think that that's the biggest misconception people have about masculinity and femininity, is that it's it's enculturated, it's socially constructed, and it is that neither would exist if not for society imposing expectations on men and women. Um, I think we've seen this, in the with the Nordic paradox, in terms of the Scandinavian countries, arguably the most egalitarian and free countries in the world, where the countries in which gender equality is most often considered to be the purpose of the law, right? Gender differences in personality have actually increased over
Mm.
time in those countries as egalitarianism has increased. So what you see is, when there's nothing coming at you from the culture telling you how to think, feel, or behave, or very little, that gives more room for what's already there innately to express. Seems to be the situation there. And so when people are more free to choose what they want to do and more free to behave in whatever way they like, what you find is men and women become more different, not less. And so that idea that these things are imposed unjustly and arbitrarily from the outside by society or by the culture, I think that that's complete and total bunk, and that idea needs to just go away. There is an aspect of enculturation and an aspect of social imposition, but it's not the entire picture.
What are the negative effects of that misconception?
Well, I think trying to there comes a point when you have to say, okay, well, women over the past 40 years, they have come to dominate to the tune of between 80 and 90%, depending on what Western culture you're talking about, whether it's the UK or the US or Australia. 80 to 90% of veterinary students are women, veterinary medicine. More than 50% of medical students are women in most Western countries now. They have swept into the law, right? Absolutely, about half of law students are women. Psychology, 80% women. So these used to be male-dominated areas, right? But now we're looking at engineering and science and technology and math, right? And we're saying there are still only, you know, 20 women for every 80 men in these areas, um, and that shouldn't be the case. It should be 50-50. Should be representative of the population. Um, well, no, no more than it should be that men and women are, 50% of psychology students, or even, women's studies students, humanities students, sociology, things like that. Um, Men and women may actually simply just have interest in different things, and when you start to see discrimination every time there's a disparity, and I don't necessarily see discrimination every time I see a disparity in favor of women. Sometimes it is a result of discrimination, but not always. But what you end up doing is engaging in injustice to bring about your vision of how things should be. And if men and women were psychologically identical inherently, like biologically, they would be 50-50 of pretty much everything. But they're not, and trying to force the issue deprives men of opportunities they otherwise would have had, and it also lures women into, because a lot of this has to do with scholarships and incentives and discounts on your grades at entry. You can get into one of these fields, one of these programs, with lower grades if you're a woman, just to fix this disparity. Um, what ends up happening is you might have women wasting 3 years of their lives on a program that they end up transferring out of because they just never found it interesting. And they don't want to do it for the rest of their lives. And those women who transferred out displaced a man who might be needed to do that job, who would have wanted to do it, or would have been willing to do what my boyfriend does and code JavaScript all day. Um, Even though it's boring and retarded, not boring, boring. Um, yeah, no, it's like, so what we have is we have this real push to equalize everything in terms of outcome, and that actually it costs a huge amount of money. Number one, that doesn't seem to work. Norway had a massive, expensive program. They spent millions and millions of dollars a year trying to attract women into STEM fields. They said, the woman in charge of the program said, every time we'd increase the spending, we'd see an improvement of 3%, and then when we stopped spending, it would go back down to where it was, right? And so how much money are we going to waste on this? And how many people are we going to deprive of opportunities? Because of some bizarre idea that women should behave and make the same choices, as men. It just doesn't seem like a good use of our time and energy and money. And it will eventually, this pathological need for perfect equality of outcome is going to end up resulting in coercion from the top down at some point. So,
Yeah. Last question. Just what advice do you have for young men like myself that are trying to figure out what it is to be a man?
don't base your opinion on, you know, who you are and what you, how much worth you have on the women around you. Firstly, they're young and probably stupid. At least they have not gained wisdom. And number two, you should not have to base your entire self-worth on the opinion of the opposite sex. That's one thing that my friends and I, try to get across to all kinds of men who get in touch with us. Some of them have never been, they're 25 years old, they've never even kissed a woman. and they have a whole bunch of really negative feelings about that often. And I think it's important to separate your sense of self-worth from that dependence on the approval of women, particularly the sexual approval of women. Go out, find a sport or a hobby, learn a skill, um, save money. You know, it's not hard to do, especially if you have parents who are nice enough to let you live with them for a little while after you're an adult. Um, acquire things that you like, uh, indulge your time and your effort into things that you enjoy, um, and be kind to people, and like just be a reasonable person. But right now, there's no way to win as a young man. So I would suggest play your own game.
What do you mean there's no way to win?
Oh, well, if you aren't successful, you will never be able to do what society expects of you, which is provide for a woman, um, in a way, in the manner to which she would like. And if you are successful, you've taken an opportunity away from a woman, and therefore you're a jerk.
Hmm.
So, um, the idea, I think, it's this idea of competition between men and women, that men and women are at best competitors for the same role, and at worst nations at war. I think that is what's really, like, that's what young men are inheriting right now, and it's a horrible, horrible thing for society to have dropped in their laps, because there really is no way to win. You can stand there and let her hit you, right? And all the people around you are going to laugh at you getting your ass kicked by a girl, right? So you can't win that way. Or you can hit her back and they'll drag you off to jail, right? That's kind of the catch-22 that men face when they're dealing with women, in any kind of situation where they're seen as in conflict or competition. And so play your own game as much as you can.
Yeah. In 100 years, if everything went perfectly for you, how would you like to see the relationship between men and women?
I'd like to see us become fellow travelers once again. I would like to see the relationship between my parents, which sort of informed all of my opinions about feminism, from the time that I understood what the word meant. Um, that be sort of a model for the relationship between men and women generally. They worked as a team 100%, and they, like, there was never a time when they were mean to each other. They disagreed, they got into arguments, they yelled at each other sometimes, but they never were mean to each other. And they always presented a united front to their kids, and demonstrated a form of affection that goes deeper than what you would maybe see in, deeper and more mundane at the same time than anything you would see in a romantic movie. It was just their way of being together. So, and I would love to see men and women come to terms like that women won't do well and children won't do well unless men are doing well, and vice versa, and to sort of look at our relationship with each other not as a competition, or not as two sets of competing interests, but as being united in our interests. That would really make me happy. And I know that's a whole bunch of bloviating about esoteric abstractifications of something that you wanted a straighter answer on, but
No, I think that's a really positive message. I think, yeah, that's really good.
oh, well, thank you. I would have wanted to give you a more straight answer, but I don't like to ever just, I don't like to ever say, here's my opinion of how things should work, right? I mean, I would like men and women to start getting along. How that's going to look is I guess up to us to decide over time. But it would be nice if we started getting along again. So
Yeah. Thank you. I really appreciate you talking today.
oh, no worries. Thanks for this, and I don't know if you're going to be posting any of
Yeah, I'm
this.
gonna post it on YouTube. I'm probably gonna cut it up. I'll probably cut it down to like a minute or two.
Yeah.
Um, but I'll
All,
make sure to send you the link.
all my 20-minute long answers now disappear. Um, yeah, yeah. No, send me the link
Yeah,
when it's
absolutely.
ready. All right, cool.
Absolutely will. You have a great day. Thank you so much.
You too. Thanks.
Bye.